Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. My guest today is Professor Kit Fine. Welcome, Kit.
Thank you. Welcome to you.
So before we get started, can you tell me just a little bit about who you are, just your career for anybody who's not aware of your work?
Yes. I was educated in Oxford. The degree was called PPE, which is Philosophy, Politics and Economics. I had a very early interest in philosophy and logic and in metaphysics in particular. My career began in England, I should say Britain actually, because I was at Warwick, Oxford and Edinburgh before I moved to the States. Then I've been at various universities in the States, including Irvine, Michigan, Ann Arbor, UCLA, and most recently New York University.
Great. And could you tell me a bit about the material that you have most sort of focused on throughout your work as a philosopher?
Well, my career is perhaps a little odd. My initial interest, even in high school, was in metaphysics. When I was in Oxford, my primary interest, as an undergraduate, was in metaphysics. But people in Oxford weren't particularly receptive to the topic. This was still, to some extent, the days of logical positivism. Strawson had written a book called Individuals, which was meant to be on metaphysics, but I actually didn't regard it as being on that topic. And so actually, partly as a result of the lack of interest, I moved more into logic. And so I spent at least 15 years of my life of my career doing logic, and then I started slowly to move more and more into metaphysics, and I was actually interested in very particular metaphysical issues, which then got me interested in more general metaphysical issues, what you might call metaphysics.
Gotcha. For what it's worth, I first became acquainted with you when I was studying vagueness. And of course, you have a classic paper on the problem of vagueness, where you kind of give the supervaluationist approach. And that's how I first encountered your work. It's obviously an area where you were very influential. But today, actually, I thought about maybe asking you to talk about vagueness, but it's something actually I've talked about quite a bit on this program with a number of people. So I wanted to tackle something new. And
I'd love to talk about vagueness actually, but anyway, it's a shame on both sides.
Yeah, I've had interviews with I had an interview with Timothy Williamson where he gave his account, and also talked to Graham Priest a bit about it. But you
well, let me just mention for the record that
yes.
I've given up my supervaluational views, so I now have quite different views on vagueness.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's good to hear. I wasn't aware of that. Interesting. Would you say something about just like in a sentence that what's the broad camp you sort of subscribe to now when it comes to?
Yes. So it's a very radical view. Almost everyone working on vagueness has thought that the central concept, or at least one approach into vagueness, is through the notion of a borderline case. And for me, that is a fundamental error. I'm trying to think of vagueness as a global rather than a local phenomenon. So we have a predicate like ball, which may be vague or indeterminate in its application to a range of cases. But it's a mistake to think of that indeterminacy as being localized, so to speak, on a particular case. So it really is a phenomenon that concerns a range of cases rather than a single case. I sometimes make the analogy with some steps being uneven. The fact that some steps are uneven depends upon how the steps are related one to the other. It doesn't have to do with any particular step. And so I hold a similar view about vagueness now.
Right. So you're saying essentially it doesn't quite make sense to say of one member of, let's say, a Sorites progression that it's a borderline case in isolation of the other members.
Yes, that's a very strong way of making the claim, because there are ways of making sense of one case being a borderline, but either that sense has nothing to do with vagueness, the phenomenon in question, or it is itself to be understood in terms of the global phenomenon. So if you take the analogy of the steps again, maybe one of the steps is out of line. Okay, so there's a sense in which that step is to blame, but there's nothing intrinsic to the step that makes it to blame. It's because it's out of step with the other stones that we say there's unevenness. So my thought is that insofar as we can, as an intelligible concept of being a borderline case, it's either not relevant to the phenomenon of vagueness, or must itself be understood in terms of a global form of vagueness or indeterminacy.
Interesting. So I do want to move on to the topic I wanted to discuss, but I'm actually very curious to find out more about this. Can you recommend, have you written any papers on this approach to vagueness?
Yeah, I've written a few, and OUP will soon be publishing a set of 3 lectures I gave on the topic. So they should probably be coming out next year.
Okay.
I've given them the boring title, 3 lectures on vagueness, but I'm not sure the publisher will allow me to get away with that.
Okay. All right. I'll be looking forward to that. So the topic I wanted to talk about with you today is the topic of ground. So actually, let me just first ask you kind of point blank, what is ground?
Well, it's probably best explained through examples. So it's actually a fine day today in New York.
It is.
So the disjunctive statement, it's fine or rainy, is true. And it's true in virtue of the fact that it's fine. So there is this connection between the two claims, the disjunctive claim that it's fine or rainy, and the claim that it's rainy. And the one is true, as we would say, in virtue of the other. So this is a kind of relationship of an explanatory or determinative relation, which people have sometimes called constitutive rather than causal. So it's not that the weather being fine is a cause of its being fine or rainy. It's rather that it's constitutive. It constitutes the fact that it's fine or rainy. So ground is this rather special notion of constitutive explanation or determination, which is illustrated by the case I just gave.
Right. Okay. I found it helpful to zero in on this phrase that you use, in virtue of. It seems like that to me kind of intuitively captures this idea. So let's maybe say a bit more kind of generally about how this works. So you said that the disjunctive claim is true, and is in virtue of the fact that one of the disjuncts being the case, and so in a way we could say that the disjunct being the case grounds the disjunction, the truth of the disjunction, or maybe another way of putting it would be to say accounts for it. Can we talk about the difference between a partial or full grounding, right? Is because it seems that the truth of the disjunct does ground the disjunction, but not necessarily completely, or maybe it does. Can you say a bit about that?
Yes. Well, some philosophers do draw this distinction between full and partial ground. In this case, they would want to say that the disjunct is a full ground for the disjunction. That the fact that it's fine wholly accounts for the fact that it's fine or rainy. But now consider a different case. Suppose it's fine and very sunny. I guess these are two different claims. Then, because I guess it could be fine without being sunny. The fact that it's fine now partially accounts for the fact that it's fine and it's sunny, but it doesn't fully account. So this would be a notion of partial ground. So this is the idea that we don't fully, but only partly account for the truth of the statement in question.
Mm-hmm. Now, to me, when I was reading about this, it seemed like in a way it's a very intuitive concept, and in another sense it can be I found it a bit slippery. And I wanted to ask you to what extent you're, I don't know if this quite makes sense, but to what extent you're a realist about this sort of relation holding between things metaphysically. That is to say, is it something that, is kind of popping up because of linguistic convention, or is there like a sort of substantial reality to the relation metaphysically?
Well, you can ask this question about almost anything in philosophy. Do you have a realist view of it or not? And I tend to be agnostic about such claims. I don't think we in philosophy are yet in a position to answer questions of that sort. But I'd like to make a methodological point that we can proceed and use a notion, and actually in a way that's quite profitable, without settling the question as to whether we want to be realist about the notion. So take mathematics. Do we want to be realist about mathematics or not? Maybe it's just an invention. Well, whether we're realist or not, clearly it's worth pursuing mathematics. And oddly enough, I take a similar view about metaphysics. Whether at the end of the day this notion turns out to be realist or not, it seems to me is irrelevant to the question of whether it can be usefully employed in metaphysics. Right. So as far as I'm concerned, the whole of metaphysics might just turn out to be some kind of invention. But as long as it's a useful invention, I don't really mind. Just as mathematics might turn out to be a useful invention.
I found it interesting that you said in philosophy that we're not yet in a position to answer such a question about realism. Do you think that this is something that could very well be answered, but we just haven't had the conceptual breakthroughs to be able to answer a question like that yet?
Right. I'd like to think in principle it could be answered. But I think we're nowhere near the position to answer the question. So let me give you an analogy. The ancients were interested in what fundamentally there is. Okay, and someone like Aristotle had the idea that there were four elements. He thought that there's water, air, fire, and water, that they would compose of these various contras and so on and so forth. Of course, we think this is all nonsense now. And the fact is, neither he nor his contemporaries were in a position to answer these questions. A great deal of science had to be done before we could even begin to answer questions of this sort. Now, it seems to me that in philosophy we're in the same position as the ancients were in regard to physics. There's a lot of just ordinary philosophizing, might put it that way, that needs to be done before we're in the position to answer these big questions like whether we should be a realist about this or that.
Do you think that the kinds of breakthroughs that we would need in order to be in a position to answer questions like that are primarily philosophical or primarily scientific?
Well, actually, I think that is one of the major questions as to whether in a given area what kind of breakthrough is required. I mean, take the case of space and time. I think there probably was, this is at least prior to Einstein, the thought that the ultimate nature of space and time was to be settled by a philosophical inquiry. I don't think anyone that would now hold that view. I think they would still hold that view about mathematics. It's hard to see how any kind of empirical inquiry could be relevant here. But something like personal identity, I think we don't really know whether somehow the science could somehow bear on the question as to what a person is. And similarly with the connection between mind and matter. So I think part of the problem is we don't even know what the problem is. We don't know what will bear on this question as to how things are fundamentally. But even if we decided that the whole thing, that it really was a purely philosophical inquiry, it seems to me that still a lot of work has to be done before one can say how things are fundamentally, and that, in particular, whether one should adopt a realist attitude towards the phenomenon in question. So again, the analogy with science, people had to learn about the behavior of macroscopic objects, gases, chemicals, and so on and so forth, before they could come up with a reasonable view as to their constitution. And this is what you might call the phenomenon, with which we're most immediately acquainted. And it seems to me that we still are far away from having a proper philosophical understanding of the phenomena themselves, which would be required before we can actually then pursue these deeper inquiries.
That's an interesting position. I want to ask you a couple of other, I think, fairly basic things about grounding, so that we have just, again, so you have a sense of really what it is that we're talking about. I'm curious whether grounding relations are necessary. So, if A grounds B, does it follow that A entails B?
Right. So, of course, you might think that it's only truths that ground other truths. So you might think that for the disjunction that it's fine or rainy to be grounded, it must be true. And so, and again, for it's fine to ground that it's fine or grainy, it must be true that it's fine. In which case, of course, the connection wouldn't be necessary, because it's not necessary that it's fine or rainy, or it's not necessary that it's fine. But what we could say, if we had this sort of factive view of ground, is that if, let's say, P grounds Q, and then necessarily if P is the case, then Q is the case, or necessarily, this is a stronger claim, if P is the case, then P grounds Q. And I'm certainly inclined to believe the first of these, so that if P grounds Q, then at least it's necessarily the case, given that P is true, that Q should be true. So every case of ground is indeed an entailment.
Okay, so it couldn't be the case that some fact grounds some other fact, and the first fact is true, but yet, in this case, it didn't happen to be the case. Like that, the second one would also be true, right? The grounding relationship is, doesn't allow for counterexamples.
Possible counterexamples, yeah. If P grounds Q, then P entails Q, so it's necessary.
Okay.
If P is true, then Q is true. If P grounds Q, we wouldn't necessarily want to say that necessarily P grounds Q.
Okay.
Because you might think that if ground is factive, that requires that P be true. But what we can say, it's necessary if P is the case, that P grounds Q.
Got it. That makes sense. Now, it seems to me that part of what ground sort of adds to entailment is relevance, right? So when we're dealing with just logical entailment, you can have, we have, of course, cases where, let's say, a conditional is true. So if it's raining, then 2 + 2 = 4 will be true, just because 2 + 2 = 4 is presumably true, is necessarily true. And there's this sort of issue that the conditional in sort of classical entailment doesn't bring in relevance, and we usually associate relevance as being involved when we use conditional and kind of natural language. And but the ground relation does involve relevance, right? So they need to be involved with each other in some way for the ground relation to hold. And so one thing I thought as I was reading about this is that the ground relation is in a way like entailment, but adding relevance. Does that seem accurate to you? And if so,
well, I would agree. Yes, I would agree with one thing you said, and not another. So relevance is relevant to ground. So the grounds have to be relevant to what they ground. And so there's a certain principle of monotonicity that doesn't hold for ground. This principle says, in the case of entailment, that if P entails Q, then P with anything else will entail Q. But if P grounds Q, it doesn't follow that P with anything else will ground Q, because the other thing may not be relevant to Q. So even if it's fine, grounds that it's fine or rainy, it's fine, and 2 plus 2 equals 4 will not ground that it's fine or rainy, because 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not relevant to it's being fine or rainy. Okay. So ground does involve this relevance requirement. No ground without relevance. But ground isn't simply entailment plus relevance, because there has to be that relevance in itself, at least on the most natural way of understanding, doesn't capture this idea, fully capture the idea that the one thing is true in virtue of the other. There is something called relevance logic, which does attempt to build this notion of relevance into the notion of entailment. And at least in most relevance logics, P and Q will entail, that is relevantly entail P. Okay. Because certainly there's a notion of relevance according to which the truth of P and Q is relevant to the truth of P. But we don't want to say that P is true in virtue of the fact that P and Q is true. In a broader sense, of course, you might say that there isn't a relevant connection, because you might say, well, this fails because Q is not it's not in virtue of the. You might just say, look, it's not in virtue of the fact that Q holds, at least in part, that P holds. But then you're just using the notion of relevance here to say what's relevant to the ground relation. So it's just another way of talking about ground. It's just a tautology to say that a ground is entailment plus relevance. If all we mean by relevance is what's relevant to the ground. So we'll put it this way, there's a very particular kind of relevance here that's relevant to ground.
Yeah.
So it's only this very particular kind of relevance, which would be such that you could even think of ground in terms of entailment plus relevance. But I myself very much doubt that there's a plausible analysis of ground in terms of these two things, entailment and relevance.
Right.
The only relevant notion of relevance here would be one that would itself be explained in terms of ground. That would be my own view, but I imagine there's room here for other points of view on this question.
I mean, it makes sense. I guess one obvious thing is that relevance doesn't tell you anything about which direction the ground relation is going in, right? Relevance always kind of goes both ways. Equally.
Possibly. I mean, I say different ways of understanding relevance. It's such an amorphous idea. But you might understand it in the way that it only goes in one direction and not in both directions. But I agree, there is this notion of relevance where if A is relevant to B, then B is relevant to A. And certainly in that case, we couldn't think of ground as entailment plus relevance.
Another kind of broad question that I wanted to ask you. So in one of your papers on this, there was one very short sentence that stood out to me as rather striking, and I wanted to ask you to expand on it. You wrote that ground stands to philosophy as cause stands to science.
Uh-huh.
I wonder if you could expand on that a bit.
Well, actually, some people don't like the idea that science is concerned with cause, but I guess I was presupposing this old-fashioned view that science is interested in these causal connections. So there's a certain kind of determination, if you like, within the natural world which science is concerned with. I mean, there is this idea of determinism, which has to do with the past determining the future. And I guess the thought was that just as the determination relation of interest to science might be taken to be a causal relation, so there's a determination relation of interest to philosophy, which should be taken to be this notion of ground. Or another way of putting it is that there are two kinds of explanation, causal and constitutive, and science, for the most part, deals with causal explanation, whereas philosophy deals with the constitutive explanation. I think science is also concerned with the constitutive explanation. I don't think philosophy at all is concerned with causal explanations. So it's not altogether an exclusive division here.
I mean, I guess the part about science, I could see how somebody would argue with it, but actually that part seemed true to me, that science is, maybe with some exceptions or there's room for objection here, but that science is concerned with causal relationships between things. I guess what struck me as rather a strong kind of claim is that philosophy is primarily concerned with constitutive relationships. I'm not sure that I can, off the top of my head, think of sort of counterexamples of philosophical issues that don't involve, the constitutive relation. But
I certainly didn't want to say that philosophy, just as I wouldn't want to say science is wholly concerned with cause or even with some sort of determination. I certainly wouldn't want to say that philosophy or even metaphysics is wholly concerned with ground. I think it's a central notion, but one of a number of central notions, and it's a central concern, but one of a number of central concerns. I'm actually rather opposed to sort of this monolithic view of what the subject is, as if all that we really care about in metaphysics or philosophy is this one thing: analysis or definition or supervenience or ground or what have you. I tend to think that those views are somewhat stultifying and probably not faithful to the actual facts, the philosophical facts on the ground, which we have to deal with when we do philosophy.
Right. Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with you there. You also wrote something about the way in which the concept of ground would be able to help us establish sort of standards for ontological reduction. So I think you said something that, like, when we have debates about whether certain kinds of entities exist, that you might be able to frame those questions as questions of whether there's a ground, whether some type of thing is sort of wholly grounded by something else, by some other kind of thing, and that would be, an important insight to the ontological question. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yes, I wouldn't quite put it that way, though other people might be willing to put it that way. I wouldn't. It's not that I want to frame these questions as questions about ground. It's rather that I think questions about ground are relevant to the answers we want to give. So anyone, for example, who wants to adopt a reductive attitude to certain kinds of entities, wants to say, there really aren't social objects like institutions or nations or what have you. They have to account for the phenomena. The phenomena on the face of it involves these entities. Okay. So in some way or another, they have to account for the phenomena. And I was thinking that any such account would employ the notion of ground in one way or another. So this would be part, so to speak, of the exercise that they have to engage in order to defend their position. Try to explain, for example, how the social facts are grounded in facts concerning individuals, or how our discourse concerning social facts can be understood without bringing in social objects, so as it were, grounding facts about what our beliefs or what have you, beliefs concerning social objects in terms that don't involve any reference to social objects. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so the thought would be that any reasonable attempt to account that someone who adopts an anti-realist attitude to these objects, any reasonable attempt to make that position plausible would involve in these ground theoretic explanations.
Would you say that that kind of ground theoretic explanation is it would be necessary but not sufficient to establish an anti-realism?
Yes and no. I mean, I think if all the ground theoretic facts were in, we'd probably know what to say. I'm not sure it would be entailed, but probably it would only make certain positions plausible. And so if, for example, we could ground every social fact in terms of individual facts, individualistic facts, then that would make it extremely plausible that we should adopt an anti-realist position towards these social facts. As it were, there'd be something bizarre about someone still insisting, well, yes, I still want to believe in the reality of these things. Mm-hmm. Seem to have a perfectly good account of how these facts could obtain in virtue of other facts obtaining.
I kind of want to press on that a little bit. And I'm curious to sort of compare that position with other kinds of relations. So, for example, you might also ask, are all social facts caused by some other type of fact? Mm-hmm. Or supervene on other types of facts. How would you sort of, what does ground tell us that those other relations don't? And why does it make a sort of difference for this kind of question about realism or anti-realism?
Well, that the social facts are caused by other facts, it seems to me doesn't really bear on the question. So it may be, for example, that God is the cause of everything. But still, there's something that he's causing, and we want to know what it is that he's causing. There's still this further question that arises. And that's the question of interest to us. The fact that social facts supervene on individualistic facts may be some kind of evidence for thinking that the one is grounded in the other. But it's not. It doesn't actually entail that. So it could be, for example, that every individualistic fact is grounded in social facts. But that's because the social facts are so sensitive to the individualistic facts. So it may be that although I think there are these facts about me, they're really facts about society. And for that reason, any difference in such a way that any social difference would always result in an individual difference. But that's not to say that what accounts for the social difference is the individual difference.
Okay, right. So you might have a case where if there was a change in the individual differences, then there would be a change in the social differences. But the accounting...
well, actually, as I say, it could go both ways. It could be that no difference in the one without... If I say no social difference without an individual difference, that's compatible with... Actually, this is another way of putting the point. If I say no social difference without an individual difference, that's supervenience. That's compatible with no individual difference without a social difference. Mm-hmm. So supervenience in one direction is compatible with supervenience in another direction.
Right.
So in itself, it has no direction. So that at least the mere claim of supervenience cannot give us the kind of directionality that we need when we say, look, we really are attempting to account for this thing in terms of this other thing.
Right. Okay. I think that makes sense. Now, it would seem to me that, so first of all, I take it that you can chain grounding relations. And so, you know, so, I mean, A may be the case in virtue of B, which is the case in virtue of C. And it would seem that this has the sort of potential to create a kind of, you know, regress type of situation. And so it makes me want to ask you if you suppose that there are such things as ungrounded facts.
Well, this is a big open question, actually. Suppose, for example, you believe that ultimately there's just physical reality as given to us by science and by physics in particular. Then, for all we know, the quest for more fundamental particles or physical objects will never cease. You know, we've gone so far down, but maybe we can keep going down and down and down. And it seems to me that's an empirically open question. So it's perfectly on the cards, it seems to me, that reality should be bottomless in this sense. I mean, it's a very weird prospect. It's not something we naturally think of as happening, but I don't see how we can rule it out a priori.
So it may be the case that there is, in fact, just an infinite regress of facts grounded by facts grounded by facts.
Right. Yeah.
But what I take it is ruled out by just the concept of ground is a loop, right? That is ruled out. I take it.
Yeah, that's my own view. That this idea of determination or explanation, in my opinion, just rules out there being loops of this sort. Yeah. So you can't go around it. You can't have A grounding B and B grounding A, and it doesn't help if A grounds B and B grounds C and C grounds A. Okay. No finite loop of this sort is acceptable.
Right.
It's the same, you know, with justification. You can justify A in terms of B, B in terms of C, but then you can't go and then justify C in terms of A.
Right. I mean, there are coherentists, but it is a tough position.
There are, and I suspect that they're not using the notion of justification. They're using some notion of support here, where there are sort of relationships of evidential support. But I think there's a notion of justification. So what I want to say about them is they don't think of that notion of justification as the central notion to be used in understanding, in some broader sense, how our beliefs are justified. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I was recently talking to somebody about justification, speaking to Peter Klein, actually, about justification, and going over the different kinds of approaches to the regress problem in justification. And we were talking about coherentism, and there is the loop, and that seems fairly counterintuitive. But Peter mentioned that, you know, the sort of strong version, or as he sees it, the strong version of a coherentist picture isn't a loop exactly. It's not like, you know, A justifies B, justifies C, which justifies A, but rather more like a sort of a web, right? So rather than a straight loop, it's more of a web that includes sort of horizontal kinds of justification relations that, you know, and maybe eventually if you take a certain path in this web, you would be able to find your way back around. But it's not doesn't really happen as a kind of loop the way you would think of it in a sort of simple coherentist picture. And I suppose
but there is a question as to whether, I mean, there are meant to be these evidential relationships, whatever they are, and there is the question whether any of them form a loop, whether you allow any of them to form a loop. Or not. I mean, there's also a separate idea, which is that there may be, so to speak, horizontal as opposed to vertical relationships. And some people talk about the notion of weak ground in this way, that A can weakly ground B and B can weakly ground A. But so that might be part of the picture. But in either case, we don't avoid the question as to whether there are loops.
Right. I mean, either you can make your way back to where you started, or you can't.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Actually, can you say more about that? The weak ground. So you're saying a weak ground would be one where there, I guess, can be a loop.
Yes. So the idea of a weak ground is one where we think of the two statements as being at the same level, so to speak. You might suppose you've got three people of this, call them A, B, and C, of the same height. You might say there's a certain sense in which A being of the same height as B and being of the same height as C is a ground for A being of the same height as C. Mm-hmm. So at least in some sense of accounting for A's being of the same height as C would be accounted for by A's being of the same height as B and B's being of the same height as C. But here, all these statements are at the same level, so to speak. So we haven't moved. We haven't moved down any kind of explanatory or determinative hierarchy, and so you might think that there are explanatory or determinative links that, so to speak, operate just on the same level. And I was imagining that maybe in the epistemic case, epistemological case, you might have a similar view. Mm-hmm. That there are these relations. I haven't really thought much about this, but there are these relationships that operate, so to speak, on the same level. And when it comes to those relationships, of course, we would expect there to be loops, because there isn't this idea that somehow there's any kind of descent, either in the epistemic or the explanatory order.
Okay. So you could have, in a sense, if you have, let's say, strict grounding, then you can only move up at every step, at every time you introduce the relation. Right. If you have weak, you could go horizontally, but you still can't go downwards. And so even if you do manage to find yourself back where you started, that only means that you stayed on the horizontal level. It doesn't mean that you ever sort of retreated.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So
there's something to be said, I think, for introducing that notion of weak ground. One might even think it is more fundamental than the notion of strict ground. And I was thinking you might also think that there's a notion of, for want of a better term, I call weak evidential support, where, as it were, we're operating all on the same. We're operating on the same level.
Now, what are your thoughts about this notion of weak ground? So you're saying that, maybe there's a case to be made that it's more fundamental. Do you think that nonetheless it is not as true to the idea of ground as we typically think of it, or
it's not the most natural notion of ground, but this is a very common phenomenon. Take the notion of part. We don't normally think of an object as being part of itself, but for the purposes of doing Mariology, that's the formal study of part. It's helpful to use this notion of part, this notion of weak part, which would allow something to be a part of itself. So even though this isn't the most natural notion, it's one that for theoretical purposes it's maybe better to use. And so similarly, I think in the case of ground, there's something to be said for taking the weak notion as primitive as opposed to the strong notion. Yeah.
Okay, so there may be theoretical or sort of methodological reasons for wanting to take the weak one as fundamental, even though the strong one is the sort of more natural or intuitive one.
Yeah, so the thought would be that you get a simpler theory of the weak notion, and then we can see the theory for the strict notions being derived from the theory for the weak notion through these definitions. And so things just look look simpler when they're done that way.
I know that you've talked about different kinds of ground on a number of different levels, and one of those is you talk about a difference between metaphysical versus natural versus normative ground, and in at least one of your papers. Can you say something about these delineations? And specifically, I was kind of curious after looking at that paper whether you think that there are these three, or whether these are just sort of examples, and there might be any number of types of ground.
Okay. Well, I perhaps had too tidy a view on this matter. I thought there were three fundamental notions of necessity: metaphysical, natural, and normative. And so I thought that there were three notions of ground corresponding to these three notions of necessity. And my hope would be that just as all other notions of necessity can be explained in terms of these three fundamental notions of necessity, so all other notions of ground could be explained in terms of these three fundamental notions of ground. So that's just a pretty picture that I have. I guess it remains to be seen whether it can be vindicated or not.
You sound as if you may have you may have sort of developed some doubts about it. Is there any particular reason?
Not doubts, but I feel that it calls for investigation.
Okay, it's not something we can just
so if you like, it's more in the nature of a hypothesis. It's an attractive view, so it has that in its favor. But I hope it's open that one could seriously consider whether it has any chance of of fitting the facts.
What about, so one of the things that I thought when I saw that is that I considered, what about something like a logical ground as something even sort of broader or weaker than metaphysical?
Yes. Oh, I see. Well, of course, with P being the ground of P or Q, that's a logical ground, I would say. But I would think of it as just an instance of a metaphysical ground, but one that holds, so to speak, in virtue of the logical form. So I would just think of that as a delimitation or restriction of the metaphysical notion. Similarly, with a mathematical necessity, I would think of a mathematical necessity just as a metaphysical necessity that's a mathematical truth. There isn't a fundamental notion of mathematical necessity. It's just that we can restrict our attention to the metaphysical necessities that are mathematical. And similarly, we can restrict our attention to the cases of metaphysical ground that hold in virtue of logical form. So I wouldn't think of that as a new fundamental category of ground.
Does this presume that the source, so to speak, of logic or of logical truths is metaphysics? I could try to specify that if that's a very vague question.
Well, I talk about being true in virtue of logical form here. I mean, I didn't really mean for that use of that phrase to reflect anything about the source of logical truth. I mean, if you ask the question, what's the source of logical truths, then of course you could take a particular logical truth like P or not P, and ask what's the source of that truth. And then I could say just P. Okay, so you might say the source of logical truths in that way is just ordinary truths. On the other hand, P or not P is a logical truth, and you might ask, well, what makes it a logical truth? And then, of course, we say something like it's being true in virtue of its logical form. And what that comes to is actually far from clear. I mean, there is this tradition according to which all it really means is that all the substitution instances are truths. What makes it not be true in virtue of its logical form is that any truth of that form is true. I myself doubt that that's the correct answer. So So yeah, those are two ways of construing that question. There are probably many other ways as well. So, but anyway, I certainly wasn't trying to suggest any particular answer to that question as to the source of logical truth.
Okay.
What I said.
I think so. One thing that came to mind that made me think about this possibility of taking logical as something separate is that I guess this is not a particularly popular view. It's not a view that I hold, but it seemed to me at least a plausible view that that essentially the facts about logic are fundamentally a function of what our minds are like, or essentially of our epistemic faculties, and not of the metaphysical sort of necessity of things. And that, if that were the case, then we would want to sort of separate out logical truths from metaphysical truths, and maybe treat logical truths as at least methodologically weaker in some way, or broader. I
see. That's a possible view. It'd be very hard, I think, to say exactly what that view comes to. I mean, on the face of it, logical facts aren't mental facts. Even if the logical facts would remain the same, even if there were no minds. So we have to give some very special sense to this idea that somehow these truths are the products of our minds. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think there's an initial difficulty even in trying to understand what that view is.
Well, I guess I'm thinking about something like if you take something just like a kind of, Kantian perspective about the sort of, I forgot what the Kantian phrase is, the not modes, the forms of understanding or something, right? Mm-hmm. If you really take a kind of extreme version of that, where what seemed to us like logical truths is actually telling us something about the structure of our mind, let's say. That's the sort of view that I had in mind when I was thinking.
Yes, and the Kantian view is subject to this very difficulty that I'm talking about, which is we don't really know what it is. Calling it Kantian doesn't explain what it is.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily I'm not in a position to defend it, since I don't really subscribe to the view either. But it seemed again, it just seemed plausible.
Sorry, let me just say that I think there's a view there that's worth exploring. So it's not that I'm dismissing the view. I'm just saying let's not be blind to its obscurity.
Right. There's another question I wanted to ask you, and it may seem like a rather silly question, but I wonder if you have an answer to it. It occurred to me to ask whether whether you would sort of speculate about what the ground is of the fact that the ground relation exists.
Right. So this is a question that many people have discussed.
Okay.
So we've got truths of the form that A grounds B. Then what grounds those truths? And people have proposed many different answers to that question. My own view is that this is an enormously difficult question, and that it's one of those questions that we're right now in no position to answer. Anyway, so I could indicate the kind of answers that one might give, but as I say, I don't actually think that we're in a position yet to answer that question.
Well, I will ask you if you could. Point taken that you have a sort of pretty strong agnosticism here. I still wonder whether you could sort of speculate about at least possible routes we might even start going to address that question.
Well, if, for example, this is a sort of more an anti-realist point of view. So you might think there's an explanation, and actually this might even feed into this idea that these truths are products of our mind. You might think there's an explanatory connection here, and the existence of these explanatory connections depends upon our minds, depends upon our only finding certain modes of understanding acceptable. Okay, our minds are so constructed that we understand A in terms of B rather than B in terms of A. So ultimately, these truths are truths about acceptable modes about acceptable modes of understanding that our minds constitute our minds. I'm not giving this as an answer. I'm just saying that is a possible answer. That would, in a certain sense, that would be a very anti-realist point of view, because we're not really, at the end of the day, talking about the world out there. We're talking about our minds, about the way our minds are, the way we are constructed to understand things. Okay.
Yeah. Actually, and that.
Now, I'm not tempted by that view, but I just give it as a possible view. But I think, you see, what's wrong with the answers that most people give to this question is that they're not genuinely explanatory. So they say things like, well, what grounds the fact that P grounds Q is P. But how does P account for the fact that P grounds Q? We're lacking any explanatory connection here. We want to understand how it is that P grounds Q. Telling me that P is the case does not help me understand how P grounds Q. On the other hand, if someone gives the kind of answer I give, if it were correct, then it would help one understand how it is that P grounds Q. So anyway, that explains why I'm not satisfied with the answers that have been given, and why what I think of as a truly explanatory answer would be very difficult to give. What lies at the bottom of this notion of determination or explanation? It's a big mystery, in my view.
Yeah,
I know it's there. I feel confident, at least, that it's there. But I don't know what, if anything, lies at the bottom of it.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, if you go the sort of kind of mental route, it's a very clean answer, right? It bottoms out at the sort of structure of the mind, and you can't really go any further. But for many reasons, that's not very appealing. And I mean, I wonder what I'm tempted to ask what would be like a kind of metaphysical an analogy to that, I mean realist analogy to that. And I think the first thing that comes to mind, and this doesn't really help answer either, but is something like that this sort of we have to take this as bottoming out as something like brute fact.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Let me just go back a bit, because I actually realized that answer could be interpreted that I just gave in a Kantian way. Okay. The one about it, grounds bottoming out and something about the structure of our minds. Okay. So we actually face the very same issue that I mentioned before. Either this is a kind of crude subjectivism, or it's a kind of transcendental subjectivism, in which case it's actually a little unclear what it is. Okay, so just for the record. Mm-hmm. But yes, you could hold the view that there's this primitive notion of determination, for example. But as many people have pointed, so we just take these facts themselves to be ungrounded. But as many people have pointed out, we then have the odd situation that these fundamental facts, that for example, P grounds P or Q, seem to involve non-fundamental facts, P or Q. They're not involved directly. We don't say P or Q is a fundamental fact, but we're saying P grounds P or Q is a fundamental fact. That seems odd. That if you don't think of disjunction as disjunctive facts as being fundamental, it's odd that ground theoretic facts about disjunctive facts should be fundamental. So that puts a great pressure upon one, it seems to me, to somehow account for these grounding facts in other terms. So we can have a reasonable view of what lies at the bottom of reality. So I myself would not altogether be happy with the view that these grounding facts lie at the bottom of reality. But how they are accounted for in terms of what does lie at the bottom of reality is not clear to me. There's just such a huge distance, so to speak, in this particular case, and not any obvious way to know how to traverse that distance.
I wonder. I think maybe I'm misunderstanding something, because I guess I don't see the problem with taking these grounding facts as primitive. I mean, I see a problem in the idea that it's just not very informative or explanatory. It doesn't really answer the question in a way. But I don't. So if P grounds P or Q, and we then ask, okay, well, what grounds the fact that P grounds P or Q, and we were to take that as sort of fundamental or primitive, you were saying that. What? Yeah, could you just restate the problem with that?
Okay. Well, let me choose another example, because it may be vivid with another example. Suppose you think that chairs don't belong to fundamental reality, but that particles do. Okay, so what grounds the fact that this chair exists is that certain particles are arranged chairwise. Okay. So now we have, in fundamental reality, the particles arranged a certain way. But now, if the ground theoretic fact that particles being arranged chairwise grounds the fact that a chair exists, if that itself is a fundamental fact of reality, then chairs have made an appearance in fundamental, at least the existence of chairs have made an appearance in fundamental reality. Fundamental reality now tells us something about chairs. And that's odd. The natural view would be, look, we just have particles at the bottom. And it's even odder to think that we don't have chairs, but we have the grounding of the existence of chairs by particles in fundamental reality. Chairs have no business being in fundamental reality. That should be the view, even indirectly through these grounding claims. We don't want fundamental reality to look like that.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I think I was confused because I didn't understand that they're sort of appearing indirectly. But you're saying even the fact that they're only appearing indirectly is counterintuitive simply because we're talking about such a fundamental level of reality. Yes,
exactly. So it's not logically incoherent. I mean, it's but there's a kind of metaphysical incoherence there. There's not a reasonable metaphysical point of view that seems to me of this sort.
Right.
We want to get rid of chairs. Period. Sorry, from this point of view, yeah.
Let me ask you about something a little bit different. You've also written about the concept of essence. Could you say something about essence so that in this conversation you could say something about how they're related to each other, if at all? Like,
it used to be that people thought of essence in terms of modality, and I thought that modal view of essence was mistaken. An example I gave was in terms of singleton Socrates, that is, the set whose sole member is Socrates. It's necessary, if Socrates exists, that he belongs to singleton Socrates. But Socrates doesn't by his very nature belong to singleton Socrates.
Okay, so basically you can have necessary facts about something that is true of something in all possible worlds, and yet it's not of the essence of that thing.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So we have these two notions of essence and of ground, and I think they are connected in interesting ways. One of the interesting ways, I think, is this, that I think it's often of the nature of something to enter into certain ground theoretic relationships. So again, take the case of disjunction. You might think it lies in the very nature of disjunction that any disjunctive truth should be grounded in one of the disjuncts. So this is not just something that happens to be true, or even necessarily true, that if a disjunction is true, then it's grounded in one of its disjuncts. But it's something about the very nature of disjunction that truths of this sort are grounded in this way. And I think that's a very common phenomenon, that it often lies in the nature of certain entities to have their properties or their behavior grounded in certain ways.
And
so these two notions come together in this way.
Right. So it is often of the essence of something that it grounds something else, or that it be grounded by something.
Yeah, I think in more the second, that it's it would. I think the first would be a little odd if it was laid in the nature of something to ground other things, but I think it's often the case that it lies in the nature of something to be grounded, or it's for its properties or behavior to be grounded in certain ways.
Why the asymmetry?
I don't really know. I think it has to do with this idea of somehow of having a bottom-up conception of objects. That their behavior is, in this sense, determined bottom-up, by its very that entities by their very nature have their behavior determined in a certain way. Maybe I'm just repeating myself, but it's not. It lies in the very nature of certain entities to be determinative of other things in a certain way. So it has to do with this sort of bottom-up conception that we seem to have of many entities. But I'm sorry, I can't give. It's a very good question. I'm not sure I can give a better answer to it, right? At least off the cuff.
I see the intuition you're pointing to, and I'm sort of asking myself something like, is it in the nature of P that if P or Q is the case, then the P grounds that, and
well, clearly not.
Sorry?
Clearly not. It doesn't. Yeah. Sorry, were you going to say?
You said clearly not.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, it doesn't lie in the nature of what it is to rain. That it's raining. If it's raining, is a ground for it's raining or being cold.
Okay. I mean, I could see that. Yeah.
So the lower level facts know nothing, so to speak, by the very nature of the higher level facts, but they may know something of the lower level, or there are even lower level facts.
Okay, that makes sense.
Sorry, I put it more succinctly. The lower level facts know nothing of the higher level facts, but the higher level facts may know something of the lower level facts. And by know, I just mean by their very nature. No.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Actually, that makes sense. And actually, in a way, the concrete example sort of helped, because when I was thinking just abstractly of pure Q, it seemed my intuition was thin either way. But when you brought up the example of rain, actually, I could see why the intuition would point more in the direction you're arguing for.
I mean, it's a very interesting question as to whether we could have a reasonable conception of objects where it went the other way. The whole thing strikes me as very bizarre, but I don't know whether it's something that's on the cards or not.
Is there any hope of having essence or ground be reduced to the other?
I think not, though some people have thought otherwise. So there are a number of views out there about the relationship between the two. I'm inclined to think of them as different but related notions.
And both of them as, at least methodologically, sort of primitive?
Exactly, yeah.
Right. Okay.
To do metaphysics, we need both of them.
I wanted to ask you, I guess, one more sort of broad topic, which was these puzzles. So you wrote this paper about some puzzles that come up with ground, and I was wondering if you could kind of run through the argument for one of these puzzles, whichever one you think is sort of simplest to kind of give an informal argument for.
Oh, okay. So one puzzle involves the truth that some proposition is true. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I take it that is true, that some proposition is true. After all, take the proposition that we're talking right now. That's true. Okay. So you might think this is an existential statement. We're saying there exists an object of a certain sort.
That is, there exists a proposition that is true.
Yeah, yeah. So you might think that it's made true by an instance. So one instance of that proposition is the very proposition itself, namely the proposition that some proposition is true. So, so you might think that any existential statement is grounded by any instance of it. So one instance of this proposition would be that the proposition that some proposition is true is true. That's a particular instance of that claim. So you might think that then that instance, like any other instance, will ground the claim.
Okay, so this is very much well, okay. Actually, no, continue.
Okay,
that makes sense.
Okay, so now we got now the proposition that some proposition is true is true. Okay. Now you might think that what makes the proposition that P is true is P. What makes the proposition that it's sunny true is that it's sunny. Or at least what partly makes it true, okay, or partly grounds it, okay. So, so then what grounds, or at least partially grounds, that the proposition that some proposition is true is that some proposition is true. Okay. But now we have some proposition is true grounding itself. Transitivity of ground. Okay, so we got one of these loops which we didn't want. Is that clear, or should I go over it again?
Yeah, I think it might be helpful to go over it again just to be kind of clear of sort of why it goes both ways, so to speak.
Okay. So we start off with some proposition is true. The thought is that that's grounded in any instance.
So any proposition that is true is going to ground the proposition that there is some proposition that is true.
Right. So in particular, we can take the proposition that some proposition is true. Its truth will then ground that existential claim that some proposition is true. Okay. But now you might think quite generally that the proposition that P is true is grounded by P. So the proposition that some proposition is true would be grounded by some proposition is true. And so we now have a circle. By transitivity then of ground, we get that some proposition is true grounds that some proposition is true, which goes against what you might think of the irreflexivity of ground. That is that nothing can ground itself. Okay. So that's one of the puzzles.
Now, I wonder if we could try to spell out I mean, I don't want to go into sort of technicalities or anything, but I wonder if we could kind of give an explanation of what are the general principles that are being assumed when we go in either direction. Right? So one is
Sorry, carry on.
So one of the general principles is that an existential claim is grounded by any instance.
Right. So if something F's is grounded by AF's, given that A does indeed F, that's one of the principles. Any existential is grounded by an instance, a true instance. Yeah.
And what was the general principle that you used in the other direction?
And then the other is that the proposition that P is true is grounded by P.
Right. So that something is true is just grounded by the sort of thing being the case, sort of simpliciter without the true. Right.
Yeah. So what accounts for the truth of the proposition that it's sunny is that it's sunny.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So then
and then we assume the transitivity of ground. That if A grounds B and B grounds C, then A grounds C. And we also, to get the contradiction, assuming the irreflexivity of ground, that nothing grounds itself. And then with those principles, we have a contradiction.
So then this is only a problem for strict ground, not for weak ground.
That's exactly right, because the weak ground with weak ground, we would have reflexivity. And indeed, one possible solution is to say that we don't have strict ground here. We thought we had strict ground in some of these cases, but we don't.
Mm-hmm. Of course, sort of intuitively speaking, it does seem that if something can ground itself, then we're losing some of that explanatory power or determinative power that this was supposed to have.
Yeah, these do seem to be cases of strict ground. They don't seem to be cases of weak but not strict ground.
Mm. Yeah. And could you say something about, sort of broadly speaking, what are some of the ways that we could sort of take?
Well, in principle, you could deny any one of these assumptions. That there are as many solutions as there are assumptions. But one possible solution is to deny that every existential statement is grounded by any instance. So you might think that a true existential statement should be grounded by some instances, but not necessarily by any instance. So that's a principle that one could give up. So some proposition is true, that could be grounded by the truth of the proposition that is fine, is sunny, but not by a proposition such as the proposition that some proposition is true, which involves the very proposition that's in question, so to speak. So that would be one line of solution, and there are various ways you might try to justify a solution of that sort. But we are now getting into a somewhat technical area. But I just to mention that as one possible line of solution.
Mm-hmm. Would it be possible for you to sort of summarize or hint at your own preferred solution without getting into too much technicality?
I don't have a preferred solution.
You don't? Okay.
So we're in the area of. These puzzles are related to this, the liar and the semantic puzzles in general, and I don't know what to say about them either. I think these are very deep puzzles. I'd like to think there was a better solution than the ones that currently exist, but I don't have such a solution. So.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, Kit, I'm gonna end it there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was really helpful.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed talking with you.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.